Hello and welcome to Art Talks Live. My name is Lynette Roth and I'm the Daimler Curator of the Busch-Reisinger Museum and the head of the Division of Modern and Contemporary Art at the Harvard Art Museums. I'm really pleased to launch this new series today and to welcome so many of you wherever you are. I do know that we have great attendance from Germany, and so also a very herzlich willkommen. As the curator of the Busch-Reisinger Museum, I always start my tours by defining that museum, one of the three institutions that make up the Harvard Art Museums. Founded in 1903 as the Germanic Museum, the Busch-Reisinger focuses on the art of Northern and Central Europe, particularly the art of German-speaking countries, a fact that I will necessarily get into a little bit more later on. Today, we will take a close look at Max Beckmann's self-portrait in Tuxedo from 1927, one of the most frequently cited paintings in scholarship on the artist and on German art of the 20th century more broadly. It is also the work of art most readily associated with the Busch-Reisinger Museum. Beckmann's self-portrait in Tuxedo is also incredibly popular in the press and on social media and with our many visitors and students. And it was featured most recently, as you can see in the lower right, in a fabulous student guide tour that also took place on Zoom. Because this painting has so many fans, it's worth looking more closely at it, not as an assumed icon or in order to somehow simply reinforce its status, but rather to examine together with you why we might be returning to it again and again. I'm an art historian by training, which means that it is my job to find out how a work has been read and interpreted in different contexts. As a scholar, and I would argue especially as a curator, it is also my job to question those readings and interpretations and to consider the meaning a historic work of art like this one might continue to hold for us today. In what follows, I have broken down this talk into what I see as the four main areas of this painting's significance. And those are institutional, art historical, cultural political, and last but not least, topical. But first, the painting. In the course of his career, Max Beckmann painted upwards of 40 self-portraits. That is a lot. Self-portrait in Tuxedo was painted mid-career when the artist was 43 years old. In it, he pictures himself roughly life-size, at knee length, and dressed in the formal attire that lends the work its name. He stands near an open doorway and stares confidently out at us. And his right palm is pressed firmly against his cocked hip, and he holds a thin cigarette loosely between the middle and index finger of his other hand. His bent arm extends beyond the surface of the canvas, effectively cropped. Thick layers of black and brown paint partially cover his face like a shadow or even a mask. In fact, a photograph of the artist from around the same time reveals that he depicted his face with some accuracy. The photo and the painting share the same hairline, rounded nose, downturned mouth, furrowed brow, large jaw, and equally wide forehead. All of you who have been to the Harvard Art Museum since our reopening in 2014 know that Beckmann's self-portrait in Tuxedo is prominently placed. In 2017, an image of it led a Boston Globe essay on sightlines, the focal point as you enter or are about to enter a gallery. The author pointed out that depending on where you stand, the Beckmann painting is framed by 1, 2, or 3 doorways. And as you can see in this early cardboard mock-up, and it's true that some of us curators still prefer our cardboard dollhouses to digital mock-ups, this decision to place the Beckmann in this way was one I made very early on in the planning for the reopening of the Harvard Art Museums. In fact, we designed a custom wall in the furthest gallery, seen here in digital form, in order to allow the Beckmann to face the courtyard and the visitor straight on. So it begs the question, of all the works in the Busch-Reisinger Museum's strong and extensive collection for this prominent placement, this literally multiple framing, why choose the Beckmann? Especially when, as I mentioned at the outset, the Beckmann is already a kind of shorthand for the museum itself. And that brings us to our first category, the painting's institutional significance. In 1948, the then Germanic Museum, housed in the Adelphus Busch Hall on Kirkland Street, which you can see here, hosted the first retrospective exhibition of Beckmann's work in the United States. During the exhibition, Self-Portrait in Tuxedo could be seen through the doorway to the museum's Renaissance Hall, flanked on either side by plaster casts of 13th century sculptures. In fact, it seems that a structure was actually built into the museum space made of wooden slats in order to allow for just this specific sightline of the self-portrait as one left the museum's Romanesque hall, and notably its foundational cast collection. This placement is significant because by this time, the Beckmann had entered the museum's collection in 1941 as its first modern painting. The first painting to enter the collection in 1909, and also a portrait, was another one entirely. It was a recent likeness of the German Emperor Wilhelm II by the academic painter Arthur Kampf. I always joke that not unlike Beckmann, the Kaiser was also a man with a penchant for portraits of himself and a love of costume. He too is seen here with his right arm pressed against his side. Now, the gift of the Kaiser portrait to the museum by one of its primary supporters, Hugo Reisinger, was highly symbolic. At the time, Wilhelm II was seeking to build a stronger relationship between Imperial Germany and the United States, and an ideal opportunity presented itself in the fledgling Germanic Museum. Joseph Kerner has convincingly argued that the Beckmann and what it represents ensured the museum's survival amid not surprising anti-German sentiment after the Second World War. The portrait was cosmopolitan rather than imperial, a shift also embodied in the museum's extensive Bauhaus collections amassed around this same time, and the focus of our major centennial exhibition last year. Indeed, the work of Bauhäusler and other artists émigrés, such as Max Beckmann, who did come to the United States in 1947, these artists émigrés have largely informed our understanding of German modernism in the United States to this day. Thus, in 1948, the viewer here stands at the threshold, the new post-war face of the collection, framed literally by the museum's historic holdings, notably reproductions, and its institutional past. Now, Beckmann's Self-Portrait in Tuxedo was recognized as a major work in terms of its art historical significance, not only in the Cambridge of the 1940s, of course, but immediately at its debut in 1928 at the annual Secession exhibition in Berlin. By and large, the exhibition is the same old thing, declared one critic, but this year a few new members have been chosen, including Max Beckmann, whose self-portrait proves once again that he is to be counted among the most important of modern painters. Beckmann's portrait really was felt to embody the art of the period, but also the late 1920s in interwar Germany itself. According to another critic, the effect is brutal, but the work is surely in the spirit of the most recent art. And I spent a lot of time thinking about this perceived brutality, which has less to do with the artist's intense gaze, because one must remember that at the time, the past few years in German painting had been dominated by the notion of Neue Sachlichkeit, which is typically translated as new objectivity. Today, Self-Portrait in Tuxedo is often understood as exemplary of the trend. In fact, it took pride of place in the Los Angeles County Museum of Art's exhibition, New Objectivity, in 2015. Contemporary critics, however, actually saw it as a definitive move away from the new objectivity that Beckmann had been associated with for several years. Wrote one critic, Max Beckmann, who has thankfully abandoned his rigid principle of objectivity, is beginning to paint again. To be clear, it's not that Beckmann hadn't been painting, quite the contrary, but rather with the self-portrait, his style shifted dramatically. And that is that sort of brutality that the contemporary critic is referring to. Compared to earlier works, Beckmann's canvas had thicker, more opaque layers of paint and more hastily defined edges, thought of as painterly. The planes of color become larger, richer, more dominant, the paint application more free, observed the critic Carl Koch. We can see that particularly in this detail of the collar of the artist's shirt with bow tie, those distinct planes of color, different blacks and whites and grays and browns that seemingly butt up against one another. And when we look closely, we can see, for example, black outlines extending over other areas of applied paint. So here the black that coats over the tip of that incredible fingernail. And in this finger, we can really see the intricacies of the brushwork and the layers of color, including the red underpainting that lend the face and hands such an incredible fleshiness. This is not to say that Beckmann's brushwork was in any way wild. In fact, when we look at infrared reflectography done by the Strauss Center for Conservation and Technical Studies, imaging that shows us what is happening beneath the surface, we see that overall Beckmann pretty much stuck to his initial underdrawing. What changes he did make, particularly to the upper right of the canvas, where we see those dark shapes below the visible paint layer, these changes were primarily in the interest of simplifying the composition. In the painting, we see this wet and wet application of paint in the gray area at the upper right. But the most dominant feature remains the artist's use of the color black to truly new effect. This black was considered the most difficult of all the colors and really the discovery of Beckmann's new pictures. In 1928, Self-Portrait in Tuxedo was purchased directly from the Secession exhibition by Germany's most important collection, that of the National Gallery in Berlin. It was the first purchase of Beckmann's work by the museum. Needless to say, as he depicts himself, Beckmann at this moment was truly at the height of his career. So now that we know that the painting was once ensconced not just in any German art museum collection, but its national one, let's take a look at its history from a cultural political perspective. Not a year after its acquisition, the self-portrait was sent to the United States for the Carnegie's 28th International Exhibition of Paintings in Pittsburgh. This exhibition would in large part lay the groundwork for the American reception of Beckmann's work, and likewise, German newspapers reported on the painter's success abroad. When it was not out on loan, Beckmann's self-portrait in Tuxedo hung in the Kronprinzenpalais, the palace of the former crown prince and home to the National Gallery's collection. And beginning in late 1932, an entire gallery that we see here was dedicated solely to Beckmann. And actually the fact of this special room was something that the artist himself had negotiated. As it turns out, the Beckmann Gallery was short-lived. After 1933, National Socialist policy changed the cultural landscape in Germany forever. While other works remained on view, the self-portrait was removed already in July 1933 and kept in storage until July 1937, when it was removed as part of the Nazi campaign against so-called degenerate art, one of 28 paintings by Beckmann to suffer that fate. And while a number of Beckmann's paintings, such as the now lost The Beach, seen here, were exhibited in Munich and in later traveling versions of the infamous Degenerate Art exhibition, which you are likely familiar with, Self-Portrait in Tuxedo was not included. It had originally been selected for the show, but joined instead works inventoried and set aside for sale on the international market. We see it here on its side in an inventory photograph taken at a Baroque castle near Berlin that the Ministry of Propaganda used to store such artwork. Despite Beckmann's European success, as we've seen, the value of his artwork abroad was initially considered debatable. Notably, Beckmann's popularity in the United States, like that of many other German artists, was actually increasing inversely with the defamation of modern art in Nazi Germany. And so in the end, his work was deemed internationally usable. So just to reiterate, besides removing or destroying modern works of art or showcasing them in defamatory exhibitions, the Nazis literally cashed in by selling some abroad. The self-portrait was transferred to the art dealer Karl Buchholz, who sent it to his associate Kurt Valentin in New York. The price listed for the painting in 1940 was $600. And by the end of the year, then Germanic curator Charles Kuhn had secured the purchase for $400. Beckmann, who kept meticulous record of his work and exactly who owned it, noted the purchase in his own list by crossing out, as you see at the right, the National Gallery, and writing above it, Germanic Museum, America. So let me return to our question at the outset and ask, what does this tell us today? What brings us back to the self-portrait of this German artist from the first half of the 20th century, again and again? Whether enthused or unsettled by Beckmann's new style, commentators on his self-portrait in Tuxedo in 1928 were kind of unsure how to interpret it. As much as it seems literally straightforward, its meaning remained elusive. On the one hand, contemporaries saw the artist wearing the smoking jacket and its class connotations like a costume, as he had done with the attire of a sailor or a clown in earlier self-portraits. Really, all you have to do is Google Max Beckmann self-portrait to see the wide array of these various costumes. Ladies and gentlemen, called out one critic like a circus barker. Here you see the German painter Max Beckmann in the mask of a gentleman. In this interpretation, the artist dons the tuxedo and the appropriate demeanor, like many of his followers on Instagram. And he does so in order to poke fun precisely at those who would see themselves reflected in his debonair appearance. Some, however, felt that Beckmann's comfort level with elite circles compromised any such critical distance. They wondered aloud if the portrait was in fact affirmative of Beckmann's relation to the conservative upper class. Art historian Adolf Behne, who was deeply invested in the social engagement of art, believed Beckmann's gesture to be hollow. His self-portrait, very striking in the glaring spotlight, wrote Behne, is the pose of one who criticizes society with deathly earnestness. And yet, he presents himself in pristine evening wear, like a young baron of industry. Much of this debate was prompted by the fact that in 1927, the same year he made the painting, Beckmann had published an essay entitled "The Artist in the State." In it, Beckmann writes that the new priests at the center of culture, by which he meant creative individuals, must be dressed in dark suits or on state occasions in tuxedo. And so this painting was thus felt to embody Beckmann's take on the artist's role in society. And yet, throughout his lifetime, Beckmann repeatedly refused to take an outright political stance. Wrote one contemporary, "Afraid of nothing, he refrains from taking up any one position." In the decades that followed the painting's acquisition by the Busch-Reisinger Museum, plaster casts increasingly gave way to original works of art, and the cosmopolitan self-portrait in tuxedo came to stand in for modernity writ large. The painting, a symbol of the artist at the height of his career, a symbol of the Nazi campaign against so-called degenerate art, and since its acquisition nearly 80 years ago, a symbol of the Busch-Reisinger Museum itself. In a 1997 exhibition at the Busch-Reisinger entitled History, Self, and Society, guest curator Siegfried Gore went so far as to remove the painting's frame in order to rob the Beckmann of some of its long accrued aura. Rather than a claim to cosmopolitanism, a way for German art to find favor in this country after the Second World War, or for a museum of German art to redefine and sustain itself, I would argue that it is the paintings and the painters' very ambiguity that speaks to us today. The question of the intersection between art and politics is an important one for artists and for cultural institutions today as it was then. Just as we need to look behind the mask of a major work of art, an icon or a symbol, and try to understand the myriad uses to which it has been put to use in the past, we also need to peel back the mask of the institution, of the structures we are living and working within, to question accepted truths, but also to be willing to accept uncertainty. It remains our job as curators and museum goers to point to more complex histories and to acknowledge that some works of art retain our attention and remain sites of truly endless wonder because they do not allow themselves to fit into our neat categories. Max Beckmann's self-portrait in Tuxedo, which still feels so modern, balances, as the artist does within it, purposefully on unsteady ground. Thank you very much for your attention.